Welcome to another episode of Mike's Money Picks. Today on the podcast, we're going to be breaking down the Thursday, February 1st slate of college basketball DFS. We have taken a few nights off on the college basketball DFS streets in terms of making videos, and it's been just because sometimes you got a lot going on in life, right? Like I've got a daughter now who's almost 5 months old, isn't sleeping all that much at night, and right now I finally got her down, and I'm hoping that she'll stay down for a little bit. That way I can get this video to you guys. So we're going to have a quick breakdown of the 6-game slate on this Thursday night. We have got a breakdown of the DraftKings slate as well as the FanDuel slate because we're going to, keep continuing to promote both sites because FanDuel college basketball is a legitimate product. Its competition will make DraftKings better. And I am currently sweating out the bank shot on Wednesday night. I am currently near the top of the leaderboard in FanDuel's $2 flagship tournament, and we're going to see how it goes. Maybe I can get myself a takedown on there, but continue to support FanDuel college basketball DFS. Healthy competition will only be good for DraftKings, and it's a pretty good product. Just because the prize pools and entries are smaller, don't get discouraged or discredited by FanDuel. So, like, if you need a promo code for FanDuel, reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to get you one. And, I know I've been a little bit AWOL for 2 days, but if you ever want my thoughts on a slate where I don't have a video for, join the Fantasy Corner Discord. The link is in the description on YouTube as well as on the audio feed as well. Fantasy Corner Discord is a lot of smart people who play a lot of DFS for a lot of different sports, and we've had a lot of great conversation, a lot of great finishes in college basketball recently with a lot of the members of the Discord, and it's an absolute blast to be a part of. It's entirely free, and so if you enjoy my content here, you want to talk it out every slate, join the Fantasy Corner Discord. There's a lot of good people in there who are ready to bounce ideas off of you and ready to, help and then sweat it out together. It's just a blast. So anyway, that's what we got. Kind of had to bring it all back together for the last 2 days being off. But now let's go ahead and start talking about Thursday, starting off with a clash in the American Athletic Conference, SMU taking on Tulane. So game number 1 of the night is Tulane heading to Dallas to take on SMU. This is the only American Athletic Conference game on the slate, which, by the way, I kind of wish DraftKings, and FanDuel to an extent as well, would have more mid-major games on the slates. Like, I'm not talking about, like, the NEC and the Patriot League and stuff like that. I'm talking, like, American Athletic, the A10, the Mountain West, like, the West Coast Conference. Give us more of some of the quality leagues in America on these slates, because I do think there's a little bit of an edge to be had in some of these games. Sometimes the pricing is a little bit softer, and sometimes the knowledge gap is there a little bit as well. And so, I would love to see more mid-majors. And, I'm saying that as a little bit of a biased person because, my school, the Charlotte 49ers, are currently the leaders of the American Athletic, and my dad's school, University of Dayton, they're currently second in the A10. So, I'm watching a lot of AAC and A10 games. I'd love to see them more on DraftKings. But anyway, I digress. So the first game of the night is Tulane taking on SMU. And the total in this one is projected to be pretty high because Tulane plays at an exceptionally fast pace. This one, KenPom has projected to finish as 83-72 in favor of SMU. The reason why that total is so high, well, Tulane ranks 13th in the nation in tempo. SMU is slightly below average at 195. So this is a little bit of a pace down game for Tulane, but the American Athletic is full of a lot of pace down teams. So this isn't something that like Tulane is not used to. Like if you look at their last game against Charlotte likes to play rock fight. Charlotte likes to really slow the game down. So definitely not something that like it super concerns me about this game against SMU because SMU kind of plays at the pace of their opponent. They've gotten into some shootouts against some of the faster paced teams, and they played rock fights against the likes of North Texas and Charlotte and Dayton. So let's go ahead and break down this Tulane side. So one thing that is important, this is really the only injury news that you're going to need to monitor for this slate is Colin Holloway as well as Juwan Gary. Colin Holloway did not play in the last game against Charlotte. He is Tulane's normal starting small ball center, and he's a pretty big part of their team. He generally plays at least over 30 minutes, and without him, what they did was they decided to start Greg Glenn at the 5, but he only played 11 minutes. He did not really do all that much from a fantasy perspective, and I don't know if that's going to change or not. Charlotte's a pretty big team, so it seems like they would have wanted to have Greg Glenn out there. But really what ended up happening was they used Kevin Cross, who is kind of their point center, as their really small ball center. And then they also had Trey Williams come off the bench, and he played 33 minutes. Now, he didn't do a whole lot. Well, he played pretty well. He had 28.75 fantasy points. I was thinking about the UTSA game. So Trey Williams, if Colin Holloway does appear out again, Trey Williams would be a guy you can go to bank on, a performance similar to what he did against Charlotte. But I mentioned that they used Kevin Cross as their center. Well, he is a point center for them. He's a very good athlete, and he's kind of the tallest player in their rotation if Colin Holloway is out. And he has a massive usage rate. He only ended up with 32 fantasy points against Charlotte, but that was his low in the last 3 games. Like, he's generally pretty much a lock to see 35 fantasy points. I think he's a great cash game play because of his role. But what that did was that made Tulane super small, and they really got demolished on the boards in that game against Charlotte. And so more on that in a second. But I think Cross is definitely in play. He's got a lot of upside, and he's one of the best plays anytime he's on the slate. Now, with the guards for Tulane, when it comes to Sion James, Jalen Forbes, and Colby King, like, it's just pretty darn random. Like, they all three like have a chance at going off, or also they all three have a chance at giving you like 7 fantasy points. It's just kind of how it works out. Now, if I were to pick one of the three of them, I think I would be rolling with Jalen Forbes. I could see an argument for Sion James. Sion James has a pretty high rebounding rate, and so especially if Holloway is out, I could see him having a good day on the boards. But Jalen Forbes is the guy who generally gets more shots, generally gets more usage. So if you're a usage rate truther, he would be the Tulane guard that I would play. But again, it's pretty random. You never really know which one I'm going to go off. There's never really any rhyme or reason for it either. So the way I'm attacking this game is, I think if you're going to play the Tulane side, you can play Cross, play either James or Forbes or King if you like. And then I think Trey Williams is a very solid play if Holloway is in fact out. Now, I did mention that Tulane was really weak on the boards in that game against Charlotte. Well, what that would open up on the SMU side is they play 2 centers, Tyreek Smith and Keon Ambrose Hilton. They're both pretty solid players. Smith is a much better per minute fantasy point player. The problem is that they split minutes, and so it's kind of hard to really have a whole lot of upside. But if they're going to be playing center against a small ball 5, there's a chance for big performance out of either Tyreek Smith or Keon Ambrose Hilton. There's also a small chance that they just get totally subbed out and SMU decides to match them and go small ball. And if they did, that would be a massive benefit to Samuel Williamson. He is their power forward usually, but like I said, they could decide to match Tulane small ball and put him as the small ball 5. And I think this Tulane spot is a great spot for Williamson, whether he is at the 4 or the 5. He's shown a ceiling with 2 games over 35 fantasy points in his last 4, and he is a elite rebounder. He gets a lot of boards. He's got double-digit rebounds in 3 of his last 4, and he's a guy who is helped out by pace-up games. You look at his game log, he plays much better, or I wouldn't say plays much better. He scores, in terms of fantasy perspective, much better against the faster-paced teams. 37 against Tulsa, 35 against Temple, 34 against Murray State, and then you look at some of his worst games, and it comes against some of the slower teams in the AAC. Like 16 against Wichita, 23 against North Texas, and 23 really wouldn't even be that bad. So I really like Samuel Williamson on this slate. I think the pace-up spot is really good for him, and I think you can play him as a one-off play or as part of a stack on this SMU side. Because the other 2 guys I think you got to consider for SMU are Chuck Harris and Zurich Phelps. Zurich Phelps is their leader in usage on the season, 27.5% usage rate on the whole season, and he's been over 30% each of his last 2 games. Now, here's the downside. He hasn't really had a super big fantasy performance in either of the last 2 games, but if you're telling me the guy's going to get a lot of shots, he's going to have the ball in his hands a lot in a pace-up spot, I think that's pretty good. But if you don't want to play Zurich Phelps, you can play Chuck Harris. He's the only other SMU Mustang who has led them in usage in an American Athletic Conference game. And generally speaking, if Phelps doesn't get there, Harris does. You can look at, the Tulsa game where Harris had 47.5 fantasy points. Now, what I don't like is the fact that Harris is actually more expensive than Phelps now. Generally speaking, I would rather take a bigger usage rate at a smaller price tag. So I think Zurich Phelps will be the guy that I would rather play on paper. But I definitely think getting one of these 2 guys into your lineup is a viable strategy. And with this being the highest, I believe it's the second highest total of the night, I would definitely be inclined to play one of those 2 guys in this pace-up spot against Tulane. Now, if you're looking for a value from this SMU side, I would recommend Jalen Smith. He has shown a ceiling of 24 fantasy points in his last 5. He's generally playing between 22 and 26 minutes, and in a pace-up game, I definitely don't mind going and grabbing my value plays from a pace-up game. If you did that on the Wednesday night slate in the Alabama-Georgia game, and you played Blue Kane and Right Cell and those guys, like, you would have been okay. So definitely I like the idea of getting my value play from one of the best game environments on the slate. Second up on the slate is going to be a battle in the Big Ten between Wisconsin and Nebraska. KenPom has this game projected to finish 76-73 in favor of the Badgers. Now, what is important to note is that we are entering a rematch season in college basketball. A lot of the games on this slate, in fact, every other game on this slate is a rematch between two teams who have played already in conference play. So what I like to do is I like to look at those previous meetings. Obviously, I like to see who did well and who didn't do well, but I think you can kind of gather a little bit of information about what is most likely to happen in the second meeting. I'm not saying just totally play, everybody just based off of their stats from the first meeting, but I do think that there's a little bit of information to be had from it. And if you think I'm lying, look at the Wednesday night slate where Joel Soriano had 50 fantasy points against Xavier in their first matchup and 50 fantasy points against Xavier in their second matchup. He was a part of my core on FanDuel tonight, and a lot of guys in the Discord were hopping on him as well. And so Joel Soriano is a guy that definitely made that pay. And I'm not saying it's going to work every time. I'm not saying that you can just take the first meeting as gospel, but it's definitely information that you can use to help build a better lineup with the second meeting. So anyway, the first meeting between these two teams was 88-72 in favor of Wisconsin. Now, on the Wisconsin side, that was a big game for Tyler Wall. He had 17 points, 8 boards, and 4 assists, good for 35 fantasy points. And it's honestly his second best performance of the season. And so, he's been kind of hit or miss lately with a floor of 10 and a ceiling of 31, but definitely a guy that I wouldn't mind going back to just based off of that performance from game one. And he's at a very affordable price tag on DraftKings as well as on FanDuel. He's really cheap on FanDuel. Chucky Hepburn in that first matchup had 31.5 fantasy points. Now, that has not been typical from what we've seen out of Hepburn lately. Lately, his shot rate is going down. He's taken no more than 6 shots in any of the last 5 games. And his assist rate has just kind of been okay. But a big reason why he had those 31 fantasy points against Nebraska was because he got 6 assists and he knocked down 5 of his 8 shots. So I'm probably not going to chase that ceiling game, but it is definitely interesting that he was able to put up 31 fantasy points in that game. Now, AJ Storr and Stephen Crowell did not hit value in that game, and it makes sense why. You had Tyler Wall putting up a massive game, and so that kind of limited the upside of Stephen Crowell. And so he only ended up with 23.75 fantasy points in that game. So if I'm lineup building just based off of what they've done, and especially what they did in the first meeting, I'm probably only going to play one of Crowell or Wall in the Wisconsin front court. And AJ Storr, we've talked about this with him all season. He's very shot dependent. So in games where he makes a lot of his shots, he's going to put up a lot of fantasy points because he doesn't do a whole lot else generally outside of scoring. Look no further than the last game against Michigan State where he was 9 for 17 from the field, 28 real points, 31.5 fantasy points. In that first game against Nebraska, he had 10 real points, 3 for 8 shooting, 22.25 fantasy points. He actually gave 5 rebounds and 3 assists. So that was a decent peripheral stats game for Storr. So I actually would be more inclined to play Storr based off of that information because the fact that he did put up some peripheral stats and he was below his normal season scoring. So that definitely actually gives me a little more encouragement to play AJ Storr in this one. Now, what is also interesting is you did have 2 bench pieces have solid games against Nebraska. John Blackwell was able to put up 15 fantasy points, which is not bad for a guy at his salary. Only played 19 minutes, was 5 for 8 from the field. And then Connor Essegian's a guy that we've talked about before. Look, he was one of their best players last season. He just was. And they have not used him at all this season. But against Nebraska, he played 12 minutes. He was 4 for 9 from the field, put up 15 fantasy points. Could there be something to the fact that it was against Nebraska? Maybe. Against Michigan State, he only played 6 minutes, but he was good in those 6 minutes. He was 3 for 4 from the field, 2 for 3 from 3, put up 9 fantasy points. So maybe we could start see Connor Essegian on the rise. I think on a 6-game slate in a GPP, I would not be afraid to punt Connor Essegian. I've mentioned time and time before, I'm generally a 20 max player when I get to, do a full build out for a slate. He's probably a guy that's going to make my player pool, but probably not a guy that's going to be in a lot of my lineups. Now, on the Nebraska side, they really struggled against Wisconsin. In fact, Rink Mask was the only guy on the whole roster that got close to 4x value in the first meeting. He missed it by 2 fantasy points. He was at 31.5 in that game. He would need about 33 to hit value at his current salary. And he's not a bad play. He's got a legitimately high ceiling. We saw the 60 fantasy point game against Ohio State. The duds against Maryland and Rutgers, everybody has duds against Maryland and Rutgers. So I don't think this is a terrible matchup for him, but I definitely don't think it's a great matchup either. Kind of the same mentality as a season, except at the opposite price tag. He's a guy who's probably going to make my player pool, but probably not going to be a guy I'm going to get in a whole lot of lineups. Now, what was real interesting in that first meeting was Juwan Gary got in instant foul trouble. And did not play a whole lot against Wisconsin. He only played 18 minutes, only put up 10 fantasy points. And in that game, Josiah Allick, played boosted minutes. He was able to play in 22 minutes in that game, but only put up 12.75 fantasy points. I say all that to say Juwan Gary is questionable for this game. And so if he is out, you would probably see boosted minutes from Josiah Allick as well as Wilcher and Lawrence. But Wisconsin's a pretty good defensive team. This isn't going to be like the biggest tempo game, so I don't think you necessarily have to go out of your way to play them. Bryce Williams is a guy that I think's got to be in consideration on almost every slate because he puts up so much in the peripheral stats. He's going to have a chance to get the 4x value, and so I don't mind him as a play either. And then Keisei Tominaga. One thing that's interesting with Keisei is he does seem generally to shoot the ball from behind the arc better at home. But in that game against Wisconsin, he was 3 for 6 from behind the arc, 7 for 10 from the field. Only put up 20 fantasy points because, like AJ Storr, he does not do a whole lot else outside of scoring. So that's just kind of how I feel about this Nebraska team. I would probably most likely to play Rink Mast, second most likely to play Bryce Williams, and I probably wouldn't play anybody else other than those two. Next up, we have the first of our few Pac-12 After Dark matchups. We've got Cal taking on Arizona. This one is projected to finish as 89-70 in favor of Arizona. This is a rematch. The first meeting was 100-81 Arizona, and that game was over at halftime. It was not even all that close. On the Cal side, one thing that I find interesting is DraftKings does not have a Q tag next to Jalen Tyson, and they'll put a Q tag on anybody's name. He did leave the Stanford game slightly early. I did not see him out there at the end of the game on the floor, and he only played 28 minutes, which is a low for like almost the entire season, except for that Arizona game, which, like I said, was a blowout. So that does need to be monitored. I haven't read anything that indicates that he wouldn't play in this game, but he did leave the game early. Like that's a thing. And so that is something that needs to be monitored. In that first meeting against Arizona, he only played those 26 minutes, but he still put up 40.5 fantasy points. He's got a massive usage rate. He's got to be in consideration anytime he's on the slate. The second half of their dynamic duo was Fardaws Amac. And he was not great in the first meeting. He only put up 23.5 fantasy points, but more on him in a second. In that first game, Keontae Kennedy and Jalen Cone, their off-ball guards, only put up 13.3 and 12.0 respectively. Jalen Celestine saw extended run in the blowout and was able to put up 20.8 fantasy points. I kind of like the idea going back to him off of that because in games where he plays a lot of minutes, he generally does pretty well. So if we were to see Jalen Tyson be out, you'd obviously see boosted usage for AMAC. I think you would see boosted usage for Kennedy, Cone, and Celestine as well as, considering they're the rest of the starting five. Now, who would step up into the starting five? I think it would be Grant Newell, who played a lot in their last game against Stanford, played 28 minutes and put up 25 fantasy points. Looked pretty good in that game, if I'm being honest, as somebody who watched it. In that first meeting against Arizona, played 19 minutes, put up 15.5 fantasy points. With or without Tyson, I think Newell is one of the better value plays on the slate. Not many guys at 4,400 have a legitimate 25-point ceiling like he does. And then if Tyson is out, you would see boosted minutes for Rodney Brown Jr. as well. But he's almost out of the rotation now. He only played 9 minutes against Stanford in their last game. On the Arizona side, look, it was a blowout for them. They put up 100 points. So obviously some guys are going to get there, right? Caleb Love, their high usage player, one of the most unpredictable players in all of college basketball. You never really know what you're going to get out of Caleb Love. And what you got out of him in that first meeting against Cal was 31 fantasy points in 26 minutes. If the game were to stay closer and he were to be out there the whole game, he's got legitimate 50 fantasy point upside. Umar Ballo had a double-double in that first meeting. We have seen Biggs be very productive against Cal all season long, and he only needed 21 minutes to get that double-double and to put up 30.7 or 33.75 fantasy points. So again, if the game's a little closer, I would like Ballo a little bit more, but I do think he's a pretty solid play. And then in a game where they get 200 points, guys like Pelly Larson are very likely to get home. He is a kind of a wing that can do it all. In that first game against Cal, he only played 28 minutes and put up 30 fantasy points. If you're sensing a theme here, it's that the starters for Arizona didn't play a whole lot of minutes, but still put up a lot of fantasy points. So one interesting angle I think you could attack this game is to play some of these up top Arizona guys like Love, Ballo, and Larson, and play some Cal guys on the other side and hope that the game stays close because you would get boosted minutes out of all of them. And it's likely to be a game that's going to feature a lot of scoring. This is the highest scoring game on the slate, according to KenPom. Now, one guy that is very interesting to me is Kylan Boswell. He had been really struggling. In fact, over a 4-game stretch, he put up about 30 total fantasy points, which is just bad. And against Oregon, he kind of looks like he's back. He played 33 minutes. He took 12 shots, put up 25.5 fantasy points. If he is back, he is a straight miss price at only 5,100. And I kind of think a game like Cal could allow him to get back, right? This is a really good get right spot against a team that doesn't play great defense. He was not a beneficiary of the blowout in the first meeting. He only played 24 minutes and only put up 9 fantasy points. The blowout king for Arizona is Moteus, I believe is how you pronounce his first name. Mateus Krivas. In blowouts, he does really well for Arizona. And in that first game against Cal, he played 18 minutes, put up 25 fantasy points. So to me, the two angles to attack this game are to play it like it's a blowout and play Krivas and maybe play another guard like a Boswell, a Lewis, or a Bradley. Or you can play it like it's a close game and play Love, Ballo, or Larson with some Cal guys on the other side. All right, that does it for the first 3 games. So let's take a quick breather, and then we're going to talk about the last 3. All right, so game number 4 of the night is another Pac-12 after dark tilt. This one between Stanford and Arizona State. KenPom has this one projected to finish as 74-73 in favor of the Sun Devils. Now, this one is also a rematch of a game from earlier this season. In that one, Arizona State won 76-73. However, I don't know if you can totally go by that because Stanford was a totally different team back then that they are now. That was kind of the dawn of the Kanan Carlisle era. In that game against Arizona State, Kanan Carlisle played 16 minutes, put up 19 fantasy points, and he was only 3,500 on DraftKings on that slate. That was before he started becoming like this team's best player, and he has been since then. He has been their highest usage player, consistently best guard since that game. I guess best player might be a little bit of a reach because Raynaud is still pretty good, but since then, Kanan Carlisle has been their highest usage player, and so I don't really know if you could go by what happened on the Stanford side in that game because now they're playing a totally different style of basketball now that Kanan Carlisle is in fact the lead dog. I think he's very much in play on this one just because of that usage rate because they're projected to get 73 points. On FanDuel, I think he's an exceptional bargain. Now, they're arguably best player, Maxime Raynaud. That's how I've been told to pronounce it is Raynaud. I'm always trying to get pronunciations right. I'm not trying to sound like I know better or anything like that, but I want to try to get the names right. So Raynaud did play very well in that first game against Arizona State. He put up 37.75 fantasy points on 15 and 15. Now, he's been pretty doggone good. The move for Kanan Carlisle into the starting lineup has been very good for Raynaud. 3 of the last 5 games, he's been over 43 fantasy points. And so I am more than willing to go back to him, even at that inflated price tag. Like, I think if you're like looking at the slate as a whole, I would probably rather pay up for Kevin Cross than to go to Raynaud. But I think he's very much in play when you look at all the other options in his price range. And I think that this does make for a sneaky little game stack. Now, after those two, there's really not a whole lot consistent that you can bank on for Stanford. They kind of rotate the other pieces quite a bit. Spencer Jones is coming in on good form, though. He was 10 for 17 from the field against Washington, put up 46 fantasy points. Against Cal, he was only 4 for 11 from the field, but watching the game, I still felt like he played pretty well. Put up 21 fantasy points in that one as well, which isn't going to cut it at 6,500, but we know that he has that ceiling of 46 fantasy points. He's gotten double-digit shots in 3 of his last 5. If I were to play anybody else on Stanford, it'd probably be Spencer Jones. It would probably come with Raynaud not in that lineup. I think if you're going to stack up the Stanford side, I think you really want to start with Raynaud and Carlisle. Michael Jones, Brandon Angel, and Andrei Stojakovic are kind of just like wing shooters. I kind of think that's their really role on the team, and I don't really think that they're really that much worth going after. On the Arizona State side, like I said, I don't know if you can bank on a whole lot from the Stanford side for Arizona for this game from the previous meeting. Boy, I worded that poorly. I don't know if you can necessarily bank on the Stanford guys on their results from the previous meeting. However, the Arizona State guys, I think you can, but also in general, Arizona State is a tough team to predict. So Frankie Collins is their best player. He's their highest usage player. In the first meeting, he was not great. He only had 23.75 fantasy points on 5 for 9 shooting, had 12, 3, and 3. I think he's a pretty good option because he's generally better than that. In 2 of the last 3 games, he has been over 31 fantasy points. And if you're going to game stack it up, he would be the guy to go with because of his high assist rate. But after that, they kind of just have a rotating cycle of Neal, Perez, and Miller where one of them seems to go off. Jose Perez is probably the guy that has this best ceiling. He does have a 35 fantasy point performance game in his last 3. He's gotten double-digit shots in the last 5. He would probably be the guy that you could bank on the most. But Adam Miller did have the best game against Stanford the first time. He put up 25 fantasy points on 5 for 12 shooting. He has been ice cold from the field lately. So if you're a shooting regression kind of guy, which there have been times this season where anecdotally that has worked out. If you're a shooting regression person, Adam Miller would have to be on the top of your list at only $5,500 on DraftKings. Now, the bigs for Arizona State are kind of hard to predict. They really like to play Jemiah Neal at the 4, and you just kind of rotate Gaffney, Celebang, and Phillips at the 5, and then whenever Neal needs a break, they play 2 of them. And there's just not really a whole lot of ceiling there with them playing low minute totals. The guy I would probably play among the 3 of them would be Sean Phillips. He was their starting center at the start of the season, and then he got hurt. He's generally a fantasy point per minute guy. In that game against Stanford, played 11 minutes, put up 11 fantasy points, and that was just returning from injury. They're going to need some size to match up with Raynaud, who's a 7-footer down there in the middle, and Sean Phillips Jr. would be my candidate to do that, thinking about it from a coaching perspective. In the last 2, he's played higher minute totals as well. He played 14 minutes against Oregon, as well as 13 minutes against Oregon State, put up 20 fantasy points in that game against Oregon State. So Sean Phillips would probably be a sneaky-ish value play at only $4,100. Next game on the slate is going to be Oregon taking on USC. This one is another rematch of a previous meeting. This meeting, according to KenPom, is projected to finish 77-76 in favor of Oregon. In that first matchup, Oregon won 82-74. However, I'm going to say this straight up, though, out of all the rematches on this slate, this is the one that you can go the least by. Both of these 2 teams are going to start 2 totally different starting lineups in the game on Thursday night from what they did in that first meeting earlier in the season. And so that would probably be the one I would bank the least amount on. However, there's some trends that I think you can go by. For example, for Oregon, in that game, Kwame Evans Jr. Had a really solid performance, like really solid. I'm talking 47.5 fantasy point performance solid. He was operating as the Ducks' primary big in that game because N'Faly Dante and Nate Biddle were hurt. Well, guess what? Now N'Faly Dante is back, and he is playing all the minutes. He's played over 30 minutes in back-to-back games. In terms of the full games that Dante has played, since he has started playing a full minute load, he has not had a game under 31 fantasy points. I think he is an absolute smash cash play. I think he does have GPP upside as well. He has 249 fantasy point performances this season, and we just heard that Evans had 47 fantasy points against him. And in terms of a per minute basis and usage rate and rebound rate and everything, Dante is a better player than Evans. So I just think Dante has incredible floor and ceiling. He is one of my objective favorite plays on the slate. Now, also, Nate Biddle is an interesting one to look out for. He is their kind of like second big man who was playing well at the start of the season, especially after Dante got hurt. He had 41 fantasy points against Montana, but he was hurt for a while, and he has played 2 games since. What they did was they moved him into the starting lineup against Arizona when they played last, but I'm sorry, they moved him in the starting lineup when they played Arizona State. So he's been starting for 2 games. I misspoke on that one. There are 2 schools that are Arizona. I got that one confused. My bad. So he's been in the starting lineup for 2 games. The downside is they have not played him more than 12 minutes in either of those 2 games. If we were to see a big minute total out of Biddle, we could probably see a big fantasy point total out of Biddle. However, I can't sit here and tell you that he's going to play 25 minutes and he's going to put up 25 fantasy points. I can't do that. So if you're playing GPPs and you want to target upside, he would be a guy that I would get into my lineups because if he does end up playing 25 minutes, he's very likely a candidate to smash when we know what Oregon's bigs did against USC in the first meeting and we know what Biddle was doing at the start of the season. Now, for whatever reason, also, Jackson Shelstad had a big game against USC in the first meeting. He was able to put up 26.75 fantasy points, and at his salary of $5,400, we would absolutely take that. But the most consistent guard for Oregon this season has been Jermaine Couisnard. He's been really good lately. 3 straight games over 28 fantasy points, 2 of which were over 35, taking a lot of shots. For whatever reason, N'Faly Dante returning into the lineup has boosted Couisnard's usage. Does that make sense? I don't know. I really don't, honestly. But it seems like Oregon is just so content to play through those two players that I kind of think that if I were to play a second Oregon guy, it would probably be Dante and Cousinard after that. Unfortunately, that gets a little bit expensive, but those would probably be the two guys that I think you can bank the most on, because when you look at the rest of the guards, yes, Shellstead had a big game against USC the first time, but Tracy, Rigsby, and Akendo are all going to play minutes, and I have no idea what their usage rate is going to look like. I have no idea what their fantasy output is going to look like. So the only thing you can really bank on this team is Dante and Cousinard. Next up on the USC side, they have been dealing with injuries. Isaiah Collier is currently out. Boogie Ellis returned from injury in their most recent game. And USC had very balanced scoring in their first meeting. In fact, the high fantasy point total for USC was from Kobe Johnson. He had 26. And he has been kind of a solid player for USC in the absence of Collier and Ellis. He has definitely seen his usage rate go up. However, USC has played some kind of dud games recently. And I hope that the flow of this one and the general pace of this one, with it projected to be over 150 point total, would help Kobe Johnson out. And I don't think he makes for a terrible play. Joshua Morgan also had 26 fantasy points in that game. He is a bargain on FanDuel as well, in my opinion. And he's been playing pretty well lately also. He put up 26 fantasy points against UCLA in 30 minutes. And that was a game that only had 115 total points scored in it. What really helped him was getting 4 blocks and a steal. So if you get a multiple block game out of Joshua Morgan, he could easily return 5 to 6x value at a salary of only $5,000. But the guy offensively for USC is Boogie Ellis. He is their best player. And he is the guy that is probably their most bankable option offensively. He did not play well against UCLA in his first game returning from injury, but all that really seemed to do was just kind of like keep his price tag the same. I was really hoping that was going to drop his price tag, and it didn't. Like, he's still sitting here at $8,300. I think it's a reasonable price tag given what he's done on the season, but the return from injury does concern me a little bit, and I would probably rather play Johnson or Josh Morgan. Now let's move to the last game of the night, talking about Oregon State taking on the UCLA Bruins. KenPom has this one projected to finish as 67-60 in favor of UCLA. This is a rematch of their previous meeting, which finished as 69-62 in favor of UCLA. So the first meeting was an ugly game. The second meeting is projected to be an ugly game, and it is not shocking because it seems like all UCLA does is play ugly games. If you're going to just cross one game off of the slate, this would probably be the game that I would cross off. It's certainly the poorest game environment, and neither of these two teams really help it either. And what I mean by that is neither of them are really predictable. Like, these two teams play a ton of different starting lineups. They got guys coming in and out, getting in the coach's doghouse and playing very minimal minutes. Like, it's very difficult to predict where these two teams are going to go. What I will say is that Akano and Bilodeau were the only two guys who ended up hitting value in that first game against UCLA. Akano ending up with 30 fantasy points, one of his best games of the season. And then Tyler Bilodeau in that one, who's kind of been probably the most consistent player from a fantasy output all season for them. He did have 33.5 fantasy points against UCLA, and he's been pretty consistent lately also. He's at 3 straight games over 28 fantasy points. In their last game, Oregon State started Jordan Pope at the 1, Dexter Akano at the 2, Tyler Bilodeau at the 3, which has really helped his fantasy scoring playing the 3, by the way. Michael Rataj at the 4, and then KC Abikwe at the 5. Look, like I said, this team is ready to switch up their lineups at the drop of a hat, but those are the 5 that started last game, and I probably wouldn't go outside of those 5 in terms of my player pool. Jordan Pope is their best player, has been their best player all season long, but he did not have a great game against UCLA, only putting up 21.5 fantasy points on 5 for 16 shooting. Now, let's go ahead and transition. I forgot to mention Michael Rataj. He's a high upside player. He's been playing really well lately for Oregon State, and I hope that they continue to ride the hot hand. 3 of his last 5 games have been over 30 fantasy points, with 2 of them being over 35. I think he's a pretty solid option. On the UCLA side, in their first meeting, there were 3 guys who ended up playing pretty well. Adem Bona was one of them. He is their best player, and he is their highest usage player on the season. And look, the poor game environments the UCLA plays, which there's been a lot of them, haven't really affected Adem Bona's outputs all that much. And so in that first game against Oregon State, he was able to put up 34 fantasy points on 13 points and 8 boards. I think anytime he's on a slate, Adem Bona is in play, in my opinion. After that, you also had a big game from Dylan Andrews, who runs the one for UCLA. He put up 23 fantasy points in that game, which doesn't sound like a whole lot, but he's only $5,800 on DraftKings. And if I'm not mistaken, he's $4,200 on FanDuel, which is a heck of a bargain. And in his last 4 games, he's had 2 games over 25 fantasy points. Look, UCLA, they're a team that's changed around a whole lot this season, but in the last game against USC, they won, and Dylan Andrews took 15 shots. The team only scored 65 points total, and he put up 29.5 fantasy points. So maybe there's a little something here with Dylan Andrews. You also had a big game from Will McClendon against Oregon State the first time, which kind of times up very well. He put up 24 fantasy points off the bench in that game, but he actually started in their last game and played big minutes against USC. He's actually played over 24 minutes in 3 straight games, but he's been playing big minutes as long as Burka Bayukincel has been out. Now, it hasn't turned into a huge fantasy game from Will McClendon, but we know that he had success against Oregon the first time with 24 fantasy points. We know that he's playing boosted minutes with Bayukincel out. I think he's a pretty solid value play, seeing at only $4,200. You will have to monitor to see if Bayukincel does end up sitting for this game, though, which I think there's a chance that he plays. And Sebastian Mack also has a questionable tag. He did not practice Monday, so that's the last update that anybody has of him. I think he's less likely to play than Bayukincel would be, but if Mack or Bayukincel ends up being out, Will McClendon would be a big-time candidate for big minutes. Brandon Williams also saw boosted minutes in their last game, playing 29 minutes against USC. However, he didn't really turn into a whole lot of fantasy points, though. He only put up 8.5 fantasy points, but he went 0 for 6 from the field. So, with a guy who's only $3,300, what if he goes 3 for 6 from the field and instead puts up 15 fantasy points? Like, then you would be absolutely ecstatic to play him at 3,300, right? So I think there's a chance to play him, and I think that this is the other team that you do have to monitor the injury situation of with Mack and Bayukincel. However, this is the caveat I'll give for this entire game's analysis, though. It's a 6-game slate. This is by far the worst game environment on the slate. You can put a big red X through this one, and I don't think that it's very likely that would hurt you a whole lot if you chose to do so, but I wanted to make sure I highlighted all the plays that have a potential to get there here in this game. All right, that does it for the Thursday night slate. So reminder, if you want more information from me, there's a few places you can get it. We already mentioned the Fantasy Corner Discord. Link is in the description on YouTube as well as on the audio feed. Also, you can follow me on Twitter at Mike's Money Picks. And I also write a full article every single college basketball slate to my Patreon, patreon.com/Mike's Money Picks. I post my core plays as well as my general lineup strategy and attack strategy for the slate. And y'all, the core for the Wednesday night slate was one of my best yet. It was 5 guys who absolutely went off, and unfortunately, I had Nick Pringle from Alabama as the 6th guy, who ended up with a goose egg. But if you get the first 5 right, you got a little bit of flexibility with that 6th guy. And so a lot of my lineups with that core ended up cashing, and I'm hoping that a lot of the patrons who follow that ended up cashing as well. So if you want to read those, there's not a whole lot of people doing cores and articles and strategy for college basketball, and I do think I provide good, solid information for that. So if you want to get access to those, patreon.com/Mike's Money Picks. All right, so that does it for the Thursday night slate. So y'all, I don't know why I clicked away there on YouTube. Sorry. I plan on being back for the Friday and the Saturday slate, but like I've said for the last week, it's been a little bit of a struggle here in the house lately with my daughter not really sleeping a whole lot. So I'm hoping that, since she stayed asleep for the entirety of this episode, I'm hoping that maybe I can get some shut-eye tonight, and then hopefully we can get her back down tomorrow night and get the Friday and Saturday episodes out to you guys. So if you want to see those episodes, make sure you subscribe to the channel, as well as subscribe to the audio feed. That way you can get notified when any new episodes drop, and you can be the first to give it a watch. And other than that, that's pretty much all I got, guys. If you like what you saw here in this video, please like the YouTube video. Please rate and review the podcast. I really do appreciate it. It really does help me out more than you guys could ever know. And that pretty much does it for tonight, y'all. Best of luck to you on this Thursday night slate. Hopefully I was able to give you some information that's going to help you build some winning lineups. Thank you guys for watching and listening, and I will see you next time.